And I want to go over this word slave because it does have a meaning that has become slightly corrupt from the way Paul's writing. I mean, Paul didn't experience the slavery of North America in the 17th and 19th century, but the word here, slave, is doulos, the Greek word. And it does mean slave. I mean, it based on the context, I mean, some translators translate it bondservant, some just servant, and some slave. And here, pretty traditionally, it's translated slave here in Romans 6. But in other places, the same word doulos is translated as bondservant. I really like slave. You just kind of have to remove and kind of work through the context of what a slave is across all generations, not just the slavery we saw in the United States, for instance, in the 17th and 19th century. So bond servitude or slavery in the ancient Roman world was somewhat commonplace. I mean, there's an estimate that I saw that even past ancient Rome's peak, it was estimated that over 25% of their population were slaves. So slavery was common, especially among households that had any bit of wealth. Slaves were often captured in battle and then sold, in the marketplace. Although people could give themselves up or their children up as slaves if they were in financial trouble. I'll get to that in a second. Now, slaves were, typically for life, although, masters would allow their slaves to save up money to pay the price that they were bought for to kind of buy back their freedom. And slaves were free to marry and have children, but if they had children then their children would be born into slavery, and their spouse had to be a slave in most cases. So a lot of slaves didn't want to have children because they didn't want their children to be slaves, especially if they didn't have a good master. And some people say that although slaves were allowed to earn money, they really were allowed to save up money and buy back their freedom. It rarely happened because one of two things. I mean, either the slave master made it so difficult for them to earn money, and so they just kind of gave up on it. They could only earn so little at a time, so it would take forever to buy it back. Or they just enjoyed the master. I mean, if it was a good master that took good care of them, I mean, think about it. You don't have to, if you're a slave to a good master who doesn't mistreat you, yes, you have tasks, you have duty. It's like working. It's like working a job. And then at the end of the day, they supply somewhere for you to sleep and somewhere for you to eat. They give you freedom to marry and to have families. And so at a certain point, it's almost like, well, it's so secure being here because my master has wealth and they can take care of me. I'm too irresponsible of a person, or I don't even trust myself to be out on the streets trying to fend for myself. I'd rather just stay a slave. So slaves typically did stay slaves for life, but sometimes it wasn't just because they were forced to, but because, either they were kind of forced to based on the amount of money that they were able to make, or because they just said, to heck with it. I mean, it's fine just being here. I'll just stay. And slave owners, as I say here, varied in their treatment of the slaves. I mean, some would treat them poorly, but some would treat them well because a slave owner might think, okay, well, it's going to be really expensive to replace this slave. So if they run away or if they die based on my mistreatment, if I beat them and don't feed them, if they die, that's like wasting an asset. I mean, that's like a bunch of labor that I could have used in the future if I had just treated them well. And so might as well treat them well, and a happy slave is maybe the most effective slave. And I think there was a very different vibe to the slavery that we have in the United States history, where force was used as a tool to control the slaves and people. And it was just I think based on historical accuracy, it was a totally different environment. Slavery was a totally different environment, although there was some variation. If you do some studying, you'll see some slaves were mistreated, some slaves were treated well. And it's just owing to what kind of family, what kind of household you were in. And slaves would have various tasks required of them, all of which ultimately were for the good and pleasure of the master. I mean, whether it was starting a fire or getting the food prepared or taking care of the children or cooking. There were also, drawing water from the well. There are all sorts of things, but they're to please the slave master. So you can kind of see this analogy starting to develop. And also, I want to mention, in some records, bond servitude could also be sold by a person of himself who was in financial trouble. So a master, someone might have run up a lot of debt, debt that they couldn't pay back and they were really in trouble for being on the hook for. And a rich person might say, okay, I can pay off your debt, but you're going to have to serve me for X number of years, 10 years or however many, to pay off your debt. And over a long period of time, you can buy back your freedom, but you're going to you can't leave. You have to dedicate yourself to me for a long period of time. And so, but sometimes, this kind of transaction would really save an irresponsible person who had gotten a lot of debt and got himself into a lot of legal trouble, would have saved them from going to jail or being attacked by his debtors. So it actually was sometimes a freeing thing or a good thing to become a slave, because you got this clean slate. And yes, you had to be stuck under this household and be a slave and do whatever they say, but it was for your own self-preservation. And so going over all of that context of what a slave really meant in ancient Rome in the time that Paul is writing this, you can see that it's somewhat similar to the slavery that we know about. I mean, it is somewhat involuntary. You do have to remain, and you're ordered, and you have to follow orders, and you have to obey. And so, but there's some other details that made it slightly less negative and slightly less harsh than the slavery that we know about from our recent